Welcome back to my channel, everyone. Today, we're diving into a mysterious and haunting story from the small town of Washington, the unsolved death of Norton Gregory. This case dates back to 1957, when Norton Gregory, the owner of a gas station, was shot and killed on Halloween night. Despite years of investigation by the police, no solid evidence was ever found, and the case hit a dead end in 1966. This story will take you through every chilling detail, with each clue leading to even bigger questions. Get ready, because this case is sure to send shivers down your spine and leave you thinking long after it's over. Let's get started. The mysterious death of Norton Gregory in Washington, USA in 1957 on Halloween night. Chapter 1. The Halloween Night Murder. Washington, 1957. A small town deep in the heart of Washington was shrouded in thick fog on Halloween night. The sparse streetlights weren't enough to cut through the heavy darkness that engulfed every corner. A cold wind blew through the bare trees, creating eerie whispers that made anyone passing by shudder. Every house in town had its lights off and doors locked, as Halloween always brought an odd, heavy atmosphere, especially here. Norton Gregory's gas station sat on the outskirts of town, far from the busier streets. It was a simple gas station, with an old, faded sign that had worn down over time. Norton Gregory, a man in his 50s with streaks of gray in his hair, owned the station. He lived alone, had no family, and hardly anyone knew much about his past. He was the kind of person this small town easily forgot. But on Halloween night, 1957, everything changed forever. That night, Norton kept his station open like usual. Although the town had long since fallen asleep, Norton liked staying up, sitting inside his small shop under the dim light of a hanging lamp. On the shelves were dusty cans of soda, a few trinkets, and neatly arranged packs of cigarettes. It was a quiet, lonely space, but to Norton, this place was all he had. He had grown used to sitting in silence, sometimes sipping on a bitter cup of coffee, listening to the sound of car engines passing by on the empty road. But on this Halloween night, the silence felt scarier than usual. The wind creaked through the cracks in the door, as if something was lurking outside. Norton tried to ignore the growing unease inside him. He had spent many lonely nights at the gas station, but there was something about Halloween that made him more anxious. The clock on the wall struck 11 p.m. Norton sighed, planning to close earlier than usual. He stood up, grabbed his old hat from the rack, but before he could turn off the lights and lock the door, a soft sound came from outside. Click. Norton froze, his sharp eyes darting toward the large window of the shop. Outside, in the dim darkness, a figure moved past. Norton's heart began to race, not out of fear, but because of the strange feeling this person gave him. He moved closer to the window, squinting to get a better look, but the darkness was so thick he could barely make out the shape of a man standing a few feet away from the shop. "Hello?" Norton called out loudly, but there was no response. The man just stood there, motionless. "We're closing soon. If you need something, come in quickly," Norton added, his voice now showing a hint of irritation. The man still didn't respond, but he slowly began walking toward the door. His movements were sluggish, almost as if he was dragging his feet. Norton's sense of unease grew stronger, but he kept his cool. He had lived through a lot, and a stranger late at night wasn't enough to scare him. The door creaked as the man opened it and stepped inside. The light from the shop illuminated his face, and Norton could see him more clearly. He was a middle-aged man, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes devoid of any emotion. He wore a long, tattered black coat, and his hands shook slightly in an odd way. "What do you need?" Norton asked, his voice colder now. The man didn't reply right away. He just stood there, staring at Norton for a few moments, as if deciding something. Then, he pulled a gun out of his coat. Everything happened too fast. Norton didn't have time to react, didn't have time to run, and before he could fully comprehend what was happening, the gunshot rang out, tearing through the quiet night. The shot was cold and precise. Norton collapsed to the floor, blood pouring from his chest, staining his old coat. The dim light from the ceiling shone down, casting a glow on Norton's pale face. His eyes remained wide open, empty, and his breathing slowed until it stopped completely. The man stood still for a few seconds, the gun still in his hand. He looked at Norton, showing no remorse, then slowly tucked the gun back into his coat. He turned, opened the door, and disappeared into the night, as if he had never been there at all. No one heard the gunshot. No one knew that Norton Gregory had died right there in his own shop. And as Halloween night passed, the small town of Washington remained in its slumber, unaware that a brutal murder had just taken place. 2. The investigation begins. The next morning, as the pale sunlight bathed the town, people began to wake and start their day. But when a passerby noticed that Norton's shop was still wide open, they felt something was off. No one had seen Norton that morning, and it was strange for the shop to be left open with no one inside. A driver pulled over, stepping inside to check, and then, the sight of Norton's lifeless body on the floor changed everything. An emergency call was made to the police. Within minutes, patrol cars swarmed the gas station. The sound of sirens shattered the peace of the small town. Jack Stevens, a young detective, arrived at the scene and immediately felt the dark atmosphere. This was the first murder the town had seen in many years, and the unusual circumstances surrounding Norton's death had everyone on edge. Yellow tape cordoned off the scene, and murmurs from the townspeople who had gathered to watch only added to the uneasiness. Jack stepped into the shop, his eyes immediately landing on Norton Gregory's body. The older man lay there, his blood dried on the floor, his empty eyes staring into nothingness. There were no signs of a struggle. Everything in the shop remained intact, with no indication of a robbery. This only confused Jack further. If this had been a robbery, why wasn't anything taken? Jack turned and scanned the room, trying to find a clue. Everything was too clean, too perfect. It was as if the killer had left no trace. But what caught Jack's attention the most was Norton Gregory's face. There was no fear, no pain. Norton had died in silence, as if he had accepted his fate long before the bullet was fired. The investigation began. 3. The first suspicions. The police started combing the area, questioning anyone who might have seen or heard something the night before. However, no one remembered seeing anything unusual. Most people had been inside, doors locked, and no one had dared go out on Halloween night. A few townspeople recalled seeing a shadowy figure pass by the gas station around midnight, but no one could give a clear description. All the testimonies conflicted with one another. There were no solid leads, and the investigation quickly hit a dead end. But for Jack, things had never been clearer. He didn't believe Norton Gregory's death was just a simple murder. There was something deeper, something stranger, that he couldn't yet explain. And from that moment, Jack knew he wouldn't let go of this case easily. Chapter 2. The Suspects and the Strange Confession. The weather was colder than usual the next day, as if the town itself was feeling the weight of Norton Gregory's death. People were gossiping about the murder, but no one really knew anything concrete. Rumors started spreading, from stories of ghosts to bizarre theories about a mysterious killer lurking in the shadows. Jack Stevens, a young detective, sat at his desk at the police station, his eyes bleary from lack of sleep. Case files were piled high on his desk, but every time he tried to find a lead, it seemed to slip right through his fingers. The Norton Gregory case wasn't as simple as he had initially thought. This small, quiet town seemed to be hiding something much darker, something far more sinister. Jack took a large gulp of his bitter coffee, trying to clear his mind. He had already questioned several people in the town, but no one remembered seeing anything unusual that night. Those living near the gas station all said they had been indoors throughout Halloween night because the weather was too cold and the fog too thick to venture out. There was nothing but vague recollections and fearful glances. 1. The first suspects. Jack returned to the crime scene early the next morning, while the fog still hadn't lifted. Norton Gregory's gas station was now cordoned off with yellow police tape surrounding the area. The quiet was eerie, broken only by the sound of Jack's footsteps as he approached the shop. Inside, everything remained exactly as it had been, as if time had frozen the moment Norton Gregory was shot dead. The empty shelves, the dust-covered counter, and the clock on the wall seemed to have stopped ticking. Jack looked around, trying to find something he might have missed on his first visit. But there was still nothing but an overwhelming, deathly silence. One of the officers had searched the area around the gas station and discovered a set of footprints leading toward the woods behind it. These footprints appeared to belong to the shooter, but as they followed the trail, it suddenly disappeared in the middle of the forest. There were no signs of a struggle, no other evidence left behind. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air right after the crime. Jack jotted down all the details in his notebook. Although the clues were still too vague, he refused to lose hope. He knew there had to be something the police hadn't seen yet, and he was determined to find it. 2. The strange confession. A few days later, with the investigation still at a standstill, an unexpected development occurred at the police station. A man named Frank Carter came in on his own and confessed to killing Norton Gregory. Jack received the news while sitting in a small town cafe, his hands shaking as he listened to the officer's report over the phone. They told Jack to come to the station immediately to question Frank. When Jack entered the interrogation room, he saw Frank Carter sitting there, his face cold but weary. Frank was a man in his 30s, rough around the edges but clearly worn down, with disheveled hair and shabby clothes. His eyes were sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. He sat there in silence, his hands resting on the table, waiting for something. Jack sat across from Frank, staring directly at him. "You said you killed Norton Gregory?" Jack asked, his voice calm but full of skepticism. Frank nodded, his eyes unblinking. "Yes, I killed him." "Why? Norton didn't have any enemies in this town. I don't see any motive for you to kill him." Frank sighed, as if he had been expecting that question. "I don't know why I did it. That night, I was driving by the gas station, and I stopped. I don't know why. There was just something that made me walk into the store. Norton was standing there, and then I pulled out the gun and shot him. That's it. It's that simple." Jack stared at Frank, feeling something was off in his confession. "You don't know why you killed him? That doesn't make any sense. You're talking as if you were controlled. Did someone order you to do it?" Frank shook his head, his eyes empty. "No one told me to. I can't explain it. It just felt like I had to do it. Like a compulsion I couldn't resist. And when it was over, I realized I had killed him. But by then, it was too late." Jack was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying every expression on Frank's face. Frank didn't seem like a cold-blooded killer, nor did he appear to have premeditated Norton's murder. Everything Frank said sounded like the confused ramblings of a man who didn't understand his own actions. "Do you have any proof that you were there the night Norton was killed?" Jack asked, his tone more serious now. "You can't just walk in and confess to a crime without evidence." Frank remained quiet, his hands starting to tremble. "I don't have any proof, but I remember every detail. I remember the feeling of pulling the trigger, the smell of gunpowder in the air. I remember his blood spilling onto the floor. It's something I can't forget." Jack looked deep into Frank's eyes, searching for answers. There was something about this confession that didn't sit right with him. If Frank was truly the killer, why would he turn himself in without any evidence? And if he wasn't the killer, how did he know such vivid details about the crime? "Frank, I'm not sure you're telling the truth," Jack said slowly, "but we'll investigate further. If you are the killer, we'll find out, and if not, you'll have to explain why you confessed." Frank didn't say another word. He just sat there, his eyes tired, watching Jack leave the room. 3. Conflicting evidence and doubts. Frank Carter's confession quickly spread through the town. People were buzzing with theories about why Frank had done it. Some believed he was the real killer, while others thought he was just seeking attention or had mental health issues. Jack wasn't fully convinced by Frank's confession. There were too many contradictions and inconsistencies in his story. Although Frank seemed sincere in describing the crime scene, he couldn't explain why he killed Norton Gregory. This only deepened Jack's suspicions. He began investigating Frank Carter more thoroughly. Through conversations with townspeople, Jack learned that Frank was a loner, with few friends and a history of minor run-ins with the law. He had a record of small-time violence, but nothing serious enough to make him the prime suspect. However, what intrigued Jack most was the fact that Frank seemed to have no connection to Norton Gregory. There was no evidence that the two had known each other before the night of the murder. A day after Frank's confession, Jack received a call from the town's psychologist. The doctor revealed that Frank had been a patient of his, and for the past few years, Frank had been struggling with mental health issues. He frequently talked about feeling watched, and occasionally mentioned a mysterious voice urging him to do strange things. This made Jack even more skeptical that Frank was the real killer. Perhaps Frank was simply mentally disturbed, and his confession wasn't based on reality. But if Frank wasn't the murderer, then who was? 4. The dark side of the case. Weeks passed after Frank Carter's confession, but the case still wasn't moving forward. The police couldn't find any additional clues, and everything seemed to have hit a dead end. Jack began feeling hopeless, as if he were being pulled into an endless spiral with no way out. But just when Jack thought the case would remain unsolved forever, something strange happened. Late one night, while Jack was sitting in his office, a stranger walked in. The man, his face shadowed in the dim light, handed Jack an envelope. "You should read this," the man whispered, then quickly left without saying another word. Jack held the envelope, feeling his heart race in his chest. He opened it, and inside was a single sheet of paper with a hastily scrawled message. "The killer is still out there. Don't believe what you hear." Chapter 3. Haunting Dreams. Jack Stevens sat quietly in his office, his eyes fixed on the anonymous letter he had received the previous night. The desk lamp cast light on the paper, illuminating the hastily scribbled message. "The killer is still out there. Don't believe what you hear." Each word seemed to burn itself into Jack's mind, sinking deeper into his soul. Days had passed since Frank Carter confessed to killing Norton Gregory, but there was no evidence to support his claim. And now, this letter seemed to confirm what Jack had always suspected: Frank wasn't the killer. And this case held even more secrets. Jack rubbed his temples, the tension tightening around him. His mind was exhausted, like something invisible was pressing down on his chest. Deep down, Jack knew this case wasn't just a murder, there was something stranger, darker lurking behind it, like a web of complexity that enveloped the entire town. 1. The first nightmare. That night, Jack returned to his small home, hoping to sleep early after many sleepless nights. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Norton Gregory flooded his thoughts. Norton's wide-open eyes, his bloodied face, and the cold death in his little shop. And then, Jack fell into a deep, disturbing sleep. In his dream, Jack found himself standing in Norton's gas station. But it wasn't the crime scene he had investigated. The shop looked completely different, bathed in warm light that streamed through the windows. Everything was clean, orderly, and the shelves were neatly stocked. Music played softly from an old radio sitting on the counter, a song Jack couldn't place but whose melody filled him with nostalgia. Jack stepped inside, feeling an odd sense of peace. Norton stood behind the counter, smiling, as if nothing had ever happened. He nodded in greeting to Jack. "Hello, Jack, you here to buy something?" Norton asked, his voice light and cheerful, completely different from the man Jack had known in his final days. Jack wanted to answer, but no words came out. A feeling of unease began creeping in. Something was wrong. Everything was too perfect, too peaceful. Yet there was an invisible anxiety hanging in the air. Jack started to feel suffocated, as though the atmosphere in the shop had suddenly thickened. Then, without warning, the music stopped, the room became eerily silent, and the lights began to dim. Jack turned toward Norton, but the smile on his face had disappeared. In its place was a pale, ghostly expression, with hollow eyes and a bullet hole in the center of his chest. Norton said nothing, he just stood there, staring at Jack with a look of reproach. "Why haven't you found the truth?" Norton asked. His voice echoed in the still air, though his lips didn't move. Jack felt something heavy pressing down on his chest. He tried to breathe, but he couldn't. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. And Jack felt himself drowning in panic. Before he could fully grasp what was happening, Norton stepped toward him, his arms reaching out as if to pull Jack into a place he desperately didn't want to go. "You need to find the truth," Norton repeated, his voice booming through the room like an inescapable curse. Jack jolted awake, his forehead drenched in sweat. He gasped for air, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. His bedroom was dark, save for the faint glow of the bedside lamp. It felt as though he had just escaped a terrifying nightmare. But the images of the dream clung to his mind. Jack sat up, trying to calm himself, but the nagging sense that something was deeply wrong with this case grew stronger. 2. Strange occurrences. After that haunting dream, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the Norton Gregory case was somehow gripping him in ways he couldn't explain. Every time he tried to find a lead, things seemed to slip further away. Every time he thought he was close to the truth, some invisible force pushed him off track. And then, strange things started happening. The first was the late-night phone calls. Short calls, with no one on the other end. Just heavy breathing, then long stretches of silence until Jack had to hang up himself. At first, he thought it was just some prank, maybe a bored teenager from town. But as the calls continued, always around midnight, Jack began feeling uneasy. Then, one evening, when Jack returned home after work, he noticed the window in his living room had been left open. Though he was sure he had closed it before leaving, nothing was stolen, but everything inside seemed slightly out of place, as if someone had rummaged through his belongings without leaving any real trace. Photos on the table were tilted. The bedside lamp was switched on, even though Jack distinctly remembered turning it off. A chill ran down his spine, but he couldn't find any concrete evidence that someone had broken in. Gradually, these small events began to build up, adding to Jack's sense of dread. His mind became more clouded, blurring the line between reality and the nightmares he faced every night. And the Norton Gregory case, instead of becoming clearer, grew more tangled and mysterious. 3. The dreams return. Jack's dreams grew stranger and more vivid. Every night, he found himself back at Norton Gregory's gas station. But each time the place looked different. Sometimes, the station was in ruins, decayed and falling apart, and Jack found himself walking through the wreckage of old memories. Other times, the station seemed like a completely unfamiliar place, with shadowy figures passing by without a word. In one particularly disturbing dream, Jack stood outside the gas station, the sky pitch black, with only a faint glow coming from inside. When Jack stepped through the door, he saw Norton Gregory, but this time, Norton wasn't behind the counter. He sat slumped over a table, his arms hanging limp, and blood dripped from a wound in his chest. Jack tried to move closer, but his feet felt stuck in place. The room grew colder, and Jack sensed an invisible force pulling him back. Norton raised his head, his eyes dark and lifeless. "You're too late, Jack," Norton whispered, his voice chilling the room. "The truth is buried, and now you can't save anyone." Before Jack could react, a figure appeared behind Norton. It was a man wearing a white mask, his face expressionless and cold. Jack recognized him. It was the same figure he had seen in previous dreams. The masked man stood silently, saying nothing, but his presence filled Jack with overwhelming dread. "You'll never escape this," Norton said one last time before his face dissolved into the darkness. 4. The masked man. Jack woke up in the middle of the night, his heart racing, sweat soaked his forehead, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was closing in on him. The dreams of Norton Gregory and the masked man had become a constant, inescapable part of his life. He sat up, feeling the exhaustion and tension weighing on him. Every lead in the case led to a dead end. Frank Carter's confession, the disappearing footprints in the woods, and now the anonymous letter and the strange occurrences happening around him. Jack knew someone was watching him. But who? And what had really happened to Norton Gregory that fateful night? Who was the masked man? And how was he connected to the murder? Jack sighed, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight, and once again, he knew he wouldn't be getting any sleep tonight. Chapter 4. Darkness descends. The small town of Washington remained shrouded in a thick mist of mystery and confusion. The cold, damp air seeped into every corner of the empty streets, as though winter had arrived earlier than expected, though the murder case of Norton Gregory had quieted down in the public eye. For Jack Stevens, the case was never truly over. It haunted him, clinging to every breath, every thought. Jack sat alone in his office, staring out the window. The light from the street lamp outside reflected dimly on the foggy glass, creating shimmering streaks that blurred the view. Outside, a light drizzle tapped against the window, a steady and monotonous rhythm. Beside him lay the crumpled anonymous letter he had received a few days ago. The wrinkled paper with the ominous, hastily scrawled words, "The killer is still out there. Don't believe what you hear." Jack had read it countless times, but the unsettling feeling never left him. He took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the paper. It felt like the weight of the warning grew heavier with each passing day, digging into his mind, reminding him that Norton Gregory's killer, according to the letter, was still out there, roaming free. Jack turned back to the leads he had gathered. Frank Carter had confessed, but no evidence had ever backed his claim. Carter seemed like a puppet, trapped in a twisted game he couldn't comprehend. Jack remembered the empty look in Frank's eyes when he confessed to killing Norton. But the confession didn't bring any real closure. Deep inside, Jack felt something gnawing at him. The truth was close, but just out of reach. Like a shadow slipping through his fingers. 1. The mysterious warning. Jack decided to dig deeper into the anonymous letter. He couldn't ignore the strangeness of it all. Someone in the town knew something he didn't. A shadowy figure, possibly the real killer, was pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But why send Jack a letter? Why warn him if they didn't want to be caught? Jack started asking around town. He went to the old cafe on the corner, a place where rumors often began. The patrons in the cafe glanced at him with curious eyes, as if he were a stranger from another world. But no one said anything specific about the letter, and no one recalled seeing anyone suspicious around Jack's house that night. As Jack sipped his coffee, Tom Harrigan, the cafe owner, approached and sat across from him. Tom was one of the town's oldest residents, having lived there long before Jack was even born. "What are you looking for, Jack?" Tom asked, his voice deep and slow. "You know, sometimes it's better not to dig too deep into things you can't understand." Jack looked up, his gaze meeting the wrinkled, weathered face of Tom. "What are you talking about?" Tom smiled faintly, but the smile lacked warmth. "The Norton Gregory case. This town has more secrets than you think, Jack, and not all secrets should be uncovered." Jack frowned, a wave of unease washing over him. "Do you know something about the case, Tom?" Tom stared out the window, his eyes distant. "I've lived here my whole life. There are things that have happened that you wouldn't understand, Jack, things even the old-timers in this town don't want to remember. Norton Gregory, he wasn't just a victim. He brought something very dark with him from the past." Tom's words were like a chilling whisper. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. But Tom said nothing more. He quietly got up and returned to the counter, leaving Jack alone with even more unanswered questions. 2. Secrets from the past. Tom's cryptic words pushed Jack to dig deeper into Norton Gregory's past. Before coming to Washington, Norton had lived in another town, a place that no one in Washington really knew about. There was little information about Norton's life before he moved here. He had lived alone, without family, without close friends, but Jack believed that Norton's past held the key to unraveling this mystery. Jack started reaching out to places where Norton had lived before moving to Washington. Most of the information he received was mundane, old addresses, property records, but one unexpected letter from a woman named Claire Donovan changed everything. Claire wrote that she had once been Norton's neighbor when he lived in the small town of Brampton, hundreds of miles away from Washington. She described Norton as a quiet man, but there was a period in his life when things changed abruptly. He became anxious, fearful, and avoided contact with others. Claire said that Norton had spoken of a stalker, a man in a white mask who appeared at night and terrorized him. "I'll never forget what he said," Claire wrote. "Norton told me that the man wouldn't stop until he was dead." Jack read the letter in silence, his heart pounding in his chest. The man in the white mask, it was the same figure Jack had seen in his dreams. A sense of dread washed over him. If what Norton had said was true, then maybe his death wasn't just a typical murder, but something far darker and more supernatural. Jack didn't want to believe in supernatural theories, but the series of events pushed him closer to the inexplicable. Now, the truth was beginning to emerge, but it was a truth Jack wasn't sure he was ready to face. 3. The worst nightmare. That night, Jack fell into another nightmare, but this time, it was more vivid and terrifying than any of the previous dreams. He found himself standing in front of Norton Gregory's gas station, but it wasn't the gas station he remembered. The entire scene was shrouded in thick darkness, and the only light came from a single flickering lamp hanging outside, casting a faint, trembling glow. The door to the gas station was wide open, and from inside, Jack heard a low, eerie murmuring, like whispers from the dead. Jack stepped inside, his feet heavy as if pulled down by some invisible force. The air was frigid, and the sharp stench of blood hung thick in the atmosphere. In the far corner of the room, Norton Gregory sat, his face blank and lifeless as before. But this time, there was something different. His eyes glimmered with a ghostly light, and his lips moved, whispering words Jack couldn't make out. And then, from the shadows, the man in the white mask appeared. He stood silently behind Norton, his hollow eyes staring straight at Jack from behind the mask. He didn't speak, but his presence filled Jack with an overwhelming sense of dread. Jack tried to step back, but his feet were frozen in place. The masked figure slowly moved closer, each step deliberate and menacing. He came nearer and nearer until Jack could see every detail of the expressionless white mask. The man leaned down, whispering something in Jack's ear. Jack couldn't hear the words, but before he could comprehend what was happening, the masked man pushed him to the ground. Jack woke up with a start, sweat dripping down his forehead. His heart pounded in his chest, and the air in his room felt stifling. He sat up, staring into the darkness, the feeling that the masked man was still there, standing in the shadows. But when the faint light from the bedside lamp illuminated the room, all he saw were the empty walls. Yet, the fear remained, lingering and persistent. Facing the fear, Jack knew he couldn't run forever. The dreams, Norton's past, and the strange occurrences all led Jack to realize that there was only one way to end this nightmare. He had to go back to Norton Gregory's gas station. The next night, Jack drove to the station. The sky was pitch black, a light drizzle falling, and a cold wind howling through the trees. The headlights of his car illuminated the road ahead, but they couldn't seem to cut through the thick darkness surrounding him. Jack stepped out of the car, his legs trembling in the cold. The gas station stood there, old and abandoned, like a ghost from the past. Everything was eerily silent, except for the wind whistling through the broken windows. Jack opened the door and stepped inside. The stillness was so profound that Jack could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He scanned the room, his eyes locked on the counter where Norton Gregory had fallen. And then, he saw it, a small wooden box, covered in dust and wedged beneath the counter. Jack knelt down, carefully pulling the box out. He opened the lid, and inside, he found something he hadn't expected, a bundle of old files. Letters from people he had never heard of, and a photograph of a man in a white mask. The sight of the photograph made Jack shudder. The man in the white mask wasn't just a figment of Halloween night. He had existed long before that, and maybe he had always been here, watching every move Norton made. And now, every move Jack made. Jack looked around, the darkness seeming to close in around him. A cold breeze blew through the broken window, rustling the leaves outside. And then, in the distance, Jack heard footsteps. Chapter 5. The Unsolved Mystery. The faint light of morning filtered through the thick fog, casting a pale glow on the crumbling walls of Norton Gregory's gas station. Now abandoned and forgotten, the station stood as a silent witness to the dark past. Jack Stevens walked slowly down the gravel path leading to the station, his eyes bleary from sleepless nights and tangled thoughts. Everything seemed to be at a standstill. The clues from Frank Carter and the cryptic conversation with Tom Harrigan at the cafe had made Jack feel closer to the truth than ever before. But the truth still eluded him, hiding behind the fog that seemed to mirror the town itself. Jack paused in front of the gas station and took a deep breath. There was a strange feeling in the air. Part of him knew this would be the last time he'd set foot here. But another part of him urged him to go inside and face what he had been searching for all along. 1. Emptiness in the investigation. Jack had once believed that every case had a solution, a culprit, a motive, a series of events that could be logically explained. But Norton Gregory's murder had proved otherwise. Despite weeks of chasing down leads, from ambiguous suspects like Frank Carter to the anonymous letter from an unknown source, all Jack had was emptiness. Frank Carter had confessed, then recanted, leaving his testimony a meaningless circle that led nowhere. The townspeople, who seemed to know more than they were willing to admit, also failed to provide answers. Tom's vague warnings about Norton Gregory's dark past had left Jack feeling more lost than ever. Trapped in a maze of doubt and invisible ghosts, Jack had come close to the truth many times, or at least he thought so, but every time he got nearer, the truth slipped further away, vanishing into the shadows. 2. The final confrontation. Inside the empty room of the gas station, there was nothing left but the fragments of time. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast streaks of dust hanging in the air, making the space feel hazy and uncertain. Jack stepped in, his feet heavy with the weight of his own fears. He stood in the middle of the room, his eyes scanning the empty shelves and the counter where Norton Gregory had once stood. Norton's haunting image, with wide, lifeless eyes, flashed through Jack's mind, like an invisible reminder of the unsolved murder. Jack sighed, frustration rising inside him. The whole town felt like an invisible trap, everything seemed peaceful. But beneath the surface was a massive darkness that no one wanted to face. And now, Jack stood in the middle of that darkness. Alone. Free. The final choice. In the deathly silence of the room, it felt as though everything had stopped. Time, space, it all hovered in this single moment. Jack had come too far, had delved too deep into this case, and now he had a choice to make. He could continue chasing the truth, a truth that seemed to grow more distant every day, or he could let go. He could accept that not every story had a clear ending, that not every mystery needed to be solved. Norton Gregory's death might remain an unsolved case, a mystery that would fade with time. And maybe, that was for the best. Some truths weren't meant to be uncovered. Some ghosts weren't meant to be named. Jack stood still, his eyes closed, letting the stillness wash over him. He realized that he would never truly know who Norton Gregory was. Nor would he ever uncover all the secrets he carried. But maybe, that didn't matter anymore. For an open ending, Jack left the gas station, closing the door behind him. As he stepped outside, the sky had already shifted to dusk, with the sun setting and nightfall beginning to blanket the town. Yellow leaves fell gently on the path ahead of him, a subtle reminder that time continued to move forward, with or without the truth. He knew that the Norton Gregory case would always be a part of him. But Jack was ready to let go. He was no longer haunted by the man in the white mask, by the terrifying dreams, or by the elusive clues. Jack drove out of town, feeling that he would never return to this place again. And as his car rolled down the road, leaving Washington behind, Jack knew that sometimes, ambiguity and uncertainty were the answers he had been searching for all along. Thank you all for following along with the mysterious story of the death of Norton Gregory. Sometimes, not every secret has a solution. And this case is one of those, a story without a clear ending, where the truth may remain forever hidden in the shadows. If you found this story interesting and want to hear more chilling, thrilling tales like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss any new content. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below with your take on this case. See you all in the next video.